Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island and we're discussing thematic elements, and today we're discussing character. When we discuss character in literary terms, we're not discussing whether somebody is good or bad, period. This is not character in the moral sense. Character analysis is a literary translation of the author's portrayal of character and how they have built the characters. And as part of that, we have to look at several things. Essentially, the characters are simply the actors in the story. They focus on, the main focus on character analysis, especially in interpretive literature, is to establish certain elements of character. And as part of that, you are establishing in my class, when you discuss character, whether the characters are round or flat, or both, in fact. Roundness has to do with characters having certain characteristics, and flatness has to do with the opposite of those characteristics, to be more specific. When you're evaluating character in my class, I need you to determine whether the characters have, for example, internal conflict. Internal conflict will be discussed more in the conflict section, but essentially we need to determine whether the character has some kind of internal struggle, an internal struggle that is manifest as part of the story. For example, in What You Pawn I Will Redeem, the pawnbroker has a clearly defined internal conflict. He explains that he knows that the right thing to do would be to give back the regalia to Jackson, but he cannot afford to lose $1,000. That battle between right and wrong, between moral and immoral, between giving back the regalia and not giving back the regalia, in some ways he wants to do both at the same time, and he can't do both at the same time, creates a very standard internal conflict. In order to explain internal conflict, you do need to explain both sides of that conflict. Another element of round and flat characters is whether or not the characters are complex. Complexity is, for some people, a difficult element, but essentially it gets down to this. Complex characters, like human beings, are inconsistent. A complex character, for example, might be both moral and immoral. They might be smart and stupid. They might be strong and weak. For example, Jackson in What You Pawn I Will Redeem is indeed, in some ways, a very moral person. He is trying to get back the regalia because he believes it is the right thing to do for his family and to honor his grandmother. He takes what money he gets and shares it with people who are needy, including the Aleuts, with whom he buys dinner, and also to give to Mary because he feels he's part of her family. He also, however, is in some ways immoral. He steals from Junior. When Junior is passed out, he steals from Junior what little money Junior has. This complexity of morality and immorality is a measure of complexity. The police officer points out that Jackson is a smart guy, and he even says, why are you're so smart? What are you doing out here on the streets? Some of the things that Jackson does are smart, and some of the things that he does show rather poor choices, stupid choices. And it's that mixture of things which is an element of complexity. In the same vein, we have stereotyping. Stereotyping occurs when a character basically fulfills the expected roles of a particular character role. For example, the police officer has a specific job, and most people are pretty much aware of how police officers are portrayed and what their job is. In this particular case, the police officer, we first meet him when he's kicking Jackson because Jackson is passed out on the railroad tracks. His behavior, in some ways, for some people, is stereotypical of certain types of police officers who essentially are just trying to move things along and are not really personally connected with people they come across, especially nuisances that they come across consistently, like, for example, drunk and homeless people. When the police officer, however, finds out that Jackson is indeed whom he's kicking, he changes his behavior toward him and his attitude toward him because he likes him personally. And in fact, his obligation, according to what we understand, is to take Jackson as this inebriated homeless person to detox. But Jackson does not want to go. And the cop, being in his position, is allowed to make that decision on the fly. He does not have to follow the rule and take Jackson in. This kind of stuff actually fits pretty consistently with what people think about the power or the lack of power, or the morality or lack of morality for the police in any given situation. And certainly the fact that the cop talks about the fact that his job is mostly boring, but he has to sometimes do things that frighten him, are also in some ways stereotypical of the job. These types of things are the elements that you would bring up as part of your discussion of how the character acts stereotypically, or at least true to form, for the role that they play within the story. Same with the pawnbroker, same with the bartender. The bartender is essentially a standard bartender. He greets people warmly and offers them alcohol, which is his job. And he likes people who have money, and he treats them well, which is his job. And when they run out of money and they act belligerently and it's time to go, he kicks them out, which is also his job. He doesn't alter his behavior much other than to fit the situation, but all of them are stereotypical for the fact that a bartender works in a very specific type of situation where you invite people to drink until they're drunk and then you kick them out. Third element is change. Change is fundamental change. Change is not the aspect of, well, the bartender changed his attitude toward Jackson, so he changed. He didn't change. He is still a stereotypical bartender. Change is a more fundamental aspect of a character that is usually more life-changing and is very often a change in their perception of either themselves or the world around them. For example, the pawnbroker does not change because he changes his mind about giving the regalia back. He knew all along that the right thing to do would be to give Jackson the regalia. So him deciding to give it to him is not a fundamental change. In fact, in some ways, it fits the stereotypical guilt-ridden guy who realizes that he's holding on to something that's important to another segment of the population. Change does occur with Jackson, however. Beginning of the story, he explains that he is invisible, that people walk right by him without seeing him and others like him, and that essentially he is unnoticed and that he's been disappearing ever since. He actually says that literally. At the end of the story, when he gets the regalia, he walks out into the street and begins dancing, and he says, I was visible. I was dancing with my grandmother and everybody saw me. Now he sees himself as visible part of society. This difference between how he perceives himself at the beginning and how he perceives himself at the end is fundamental change, and it's something that we expect that really has changed how he views himself, not just for the moment, but in the long term. Fundamental change makes a character dynamic. If the character remains static, like the pawnbroker, like the bartender, those characters are not changing, and therefore, like I said, they are static. As part of your analysis of roundness and flatness, a character who has internal conflict is exhibiting roundness. A character who is showing complexity is exhibiting roundness. A character who has fundamental change is exhibiting roundness. A character who is stereotypical is not exhibiting roundness and is therefore showing flatness. A character who does not change, who is static, is also flat. A character who does not have internal conflict is flat. And characters can be both round and flat. A character can have internal conflict but still be stereotypical and not change. That would make the character both round and flat, and that is part of your argument. Keep in mind that generally we're looking for elements that determine how the author's using this in the story. Realistically, your main characters are more likely to be round than other minor characters. However, that is not necessarily going to be true to the case. For example, the character Junior in Tooth and Claw. Through the course of the story, many things happen that changes his lifestyle. But ultimately, at the beginning, he is this lonely, isolated loser who's kind of depressed and kind of fatalistic. And at the end, he is this lonely, isolated loser who's fatalistic. And ultimately, this character does not change. He is the main character of the story, but he does not change. Is he complex? For sure. Does he have some internal conflicts? Absolutely. But he does not change. And so don't try to automatically incorporate elements of roundness into your main characters. I will tell you that minor characters are generally flat, but there may be some complexities to them, and you have to examine each character individually and determine what is appropriate. Remember, you're looking for evidence within the story to support that. Obviously, showing a character has no internal conflict is difficult, but showing a character does have internal conflict requires that you show me where that happens in the story. Claiming a character does change, you would explain what they were at the beginning and what they are at the end and how that's different, or that the character does not change, that there's something consistent all the way through. Use the story, and if the story does not substantiate your claim, reevaluate your claim. Okay? Roundness and flatness is an important part of the first paper, and I want you to get a handle on that because these elements also introduce you to conflict, which we can discuss at another time. Stay in touch.